Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to everything you wanted to know about Substrate, but were afraid to ask. I'd like to tell you a little bit about me before we get started. My name's Nathaniel Morgan, and I'm a principal technical artist here at Epic Games. I'm one of the product owners for the rendering systems of Unreal Engine, and I'm here to talk to you about our new material system, Substrate. I want to underscore that I'm here representing the work of the whole Substrate team, and most especially the main engineers responsible for Substrate, Sébastien Hilaire and Charles de Rouzier, without whom none of this would be possible. So Substrate is now production ready as of Unreal 5.7. I'd like to take some time to explore with you what Substrate is, why it represents a fundamental shift in Unreal Engine's shading model, and how to start using it effectively in your own projects. Whether you're working in games, linear content, or CG visualization, Substrate gives you more control over surface shading, greater visual fidelity, and a more expressive material system, without relying on hacky or otherwise brittle shader workarounds. Before we dive in, here's a quick overview of what we'll cover. We'll start by defining what Substrate is and why it matters, especially in terms of how it changes the way shading is handled in Unreal Engine. From there, we'll compare it to the legacy material system and highlight the new capabilities it unlocks. We'll look at the benefits for both artists and tech artists, especially in terms of layering, realism, and material flexibility. Then we'll walk through how to migrate content, what compatibility looks like, and how to approach the transition incrementally. After that, we'll talk about some common pitfalls and performance considerations, especially when working with layered materials and composition operators. Finally, we'll wrap up with a look at where Substrate is headed and close with some key takeaways and a bit of time for questions. Substrate is a deep topic, so to make it approachable, we're going to explore it in layers. I'll start with the most intuitive level, what this means for artists, and then build towards how it works under the hood and what it changes in the rendering architecture. Put simply, Substrate is Unreal Engine's new material system, and it fundamentally changes how we think about shading. In legacy workflows, you had to pick a shading model like default lit or subsurface and hope it fit your use case. Substrate removes that restriction. It lets you directly blend in shading behaviors like fuzz, clear coat, or subsurface scattering without switching models or resorting to hacks. Take the image on this slide. It shows a complex material topology that would have been impossible in the old system. It blends a subsurface base with a metallic layer, which combines with a tinted clear coat, and finally, a variable thickness goo layer is drizzled on top. It's synthetic, yes, but there is similar layering in real use cases like sweat on skin or ice over rock. For artists, Substrate gives much more expressive control and helps materials behave more intuitively under lighting, especially for layered or physically rich surfaces. With legacy materials in Unreal, only one shading model could be active per pixel. That meant you had to choose. Do you want subsurface scattering, or do you want clear coat? You couldn't combine them freely. This limitation made it difficult to build complex or hybrid materials, especially when the surface needed to exhibit multiple shading behaviors. Substrate replaces that constraint with slabs, which are modular, physically parameterized building blocks that you define directly in the material graph. These slabs are self-contained models of light surface interaction. Essentially, they're shading models in their own right, but with the added benefit that they can be composed using operators like blending or mixing. The expressive range of the simplest substrate materials is broad enough to recreate many previously custom or shader-hacked effects, such as oily skin, automotive paint, or fabrics with anisotropic highlights. In practical terms, Substrate allows developers to blend closures in an ad hoc fashion. That means far fewer restrictions on how materials are layered, and a lot more freedom to express what a surface is, rather than fitting it into a predefined model. We'll walk through a specific example of this kind of complex layering behavior in a later slide. But for now, Just keep in mind that Substrate doesn't ask you to choose a shading model. It allows you to build one, tailored to your material's actual properties. At its most fundamental level, Substrate is a complete reconfiguration of the G-buffer, and we'll get to the asterisk there in a bit. Instead of using a fixed G-buffer layout, like traditional deferred rendering, Substrate stores material properties in packed GPU buffers. So this isn't just about changing a shading model. We're actually replacing how the renderer stores and evaluates material data per pixel. One key consequence of this change is that hardware blending is no longer supported. But what we gain is the ability to store multiple closures per pixel and to blend material data in ways that were previously impossible, enabling far more nuanced and dynamic shading behavior. Substrate is also designed for scalability. It can simplify or drop expensive configurations automatically on platforms that don't support the full feature set, like mobile or older consoles, or even if the material falls outside the budget established in the INI files. To make this work, Substrate scales memory allocation dynamically based on pixel complexity, and the threshold for simplification is configurable per platform. What this means for you is you can author a high-end material once, and it will scale down to your target hardware without duplicating assets or fragmenting your content pipeline. So why have we been working on Substrate? Legacy materials in Unreal work really well. They've served us for years. But there are definitely some notable limitations that can make certain looks difficult or even impossible to author. Even in standard production workflows, things like stylized shading, semiconductors or gemstones, or dielectrics with complex light behavior, content teams often run into constraints that require sophisticated workarounds. Take a simple example, blending the metallic parameter from 0 to 1 in default lit. You'll often see white-edged artifacts in the transition zone, not because the shading model is broken, but because the math becomes ill-defined between metallic and dielectric states. Substrate avoids this by reparameterizing the material to specify the problematic properties, metallic, specular, and base color, as diffuse color and F0, which is the reflectance at view incidence. This, in conjunction with its inherent energy conservation, permits a continuous, well-defined transition between dielectric and metallic material behaviors. In the most demanding situations, Substrate can even evaluate and compose closures separately to resolve the blend in a physically correct way. And importantly, it does this efficiently. The more expensive composed evaluation only occurs in the transition regions. Tiles where the mix is 0 or 1 still use the faster single closure path. And here are all the methods discussed side by side with the relevant crop. Another common pain point is chromatic specular on dielectrics. Examples of this would be thin film interference or some other form of structural coloration. In the legacy system, non-metallic surfaces can't produce colored specular highlights without hacks. Substrate exposes F0 as a Vec3, so you can define chromatic specular directly, even on dielectrics, and have it respond properly to lighting. Substrate enforces energy conservation to ensure the balance of diffuse and specular remain plausible. It's even possible to have light-facing specular effects in Substrate by using a specular profile asset. Let's stay on the topic of specular for a moment. The legacy specular input is tuned for common dielectrics. It maps a range of IORs from 1 to 1.788 as a single float, and these in turn return an F0 of between 0 and 0.08. That works for most materials, but breaks down for metalloids, semiconductors, gemstones, even something common like carbon fiber, all of which set well above that F0 range. In the case of carbon fiber, it's about 0.18. The point here is IOR, specular, and F0 are different ways of expressing the same property. And Substrate exposes the most elemental form, F0, and giving you precision and control. This also makes manual IOR tracking more plausible, especially in layered materials or scenarios where the external IOR is not one, like rendering underwater. These aren't edge cases. These issues come up regularly in all areas of production. Earlier, I mentioned that Substrate introduces a complete reconfiguration of the G-buffer. But there's an asterisk to that, because how Substrate stores and accesses data actually depends on which rendering path is used. There are two G-buffer modes in Substrate today, the adaptive G-buffer and the blendable G-buffer. Let's break them down. The adaptive G-buffer is intended to be the new default for Shader Model 6 platforms and new projects targeting PC SM6, PlayStation 5, and the Xbox Series consoles. However, whether we enable this for all SM6 projects or just a subset of templates will depend on some data we're gathering right now during our ongoing performance testing leading up to the 5.7 release. The adaptive G-buffer uses a set of bit-packed UAVs to encode Substrate data per pixel. And this enables all of Substrate's features, including closure blending and per-pixel material topology. And this is the mode that delivers the full flexibility and expressiveness of the system. There is a minor caveat to using the adaptive G-buffer. Because the data is packed, hardware blending is no longer supported. This further implies that debuffer decals are the only method for applying decals when using the adaptive G-buffer, and they will be used regardless of your decal project setting. There is an option to render these decals either during or after the base pass to access the material normal without any temporal reprojection or depth reconstruction. The blendable G-buffer is a compatibility fallback used for Shader Model 5 and other limited platforms, and projects upgrading from previous versions that don't have either Substrate experimental or beta enabled. This mode uses the traditional G-buffer layout with support for blending and carries limited Substrate data from the base pass. It's constrained to a single slab and feature per pixel, so more advanced Substrate features, like layered closures or complex blends, are automatically simplified. The list of used features is visible under the Material Editor's Substrate panel, which mentions all of the features used by the material and lists them in the order by which they will be downgraded. All that said, it's designed to hit performance and memory parity with legacy rendering. It's designed to hit a 60 FPS target, especially for previous gen consoles. It simplifies or strips unsupported Substrate features automatically, and it offers the current choice of decal methods, either blendable or debuffer decals. Using the blendable G-buffer still benefits from the baseline Substrate improvements, but it doesn't support the full system behavior. This makes it a safe and low-risk compatibility layer, ideal for teams who want to gradually adopt Substrate without touching every material. So in short, Substrate materials scale across hardware, but their capabilities depend on the G-buffer mode in use. If you're on an SM6-capable platform, you can get everything that Substrate offers. But if you're in a lower end or legacy target, you still benefit from some of Substrate's core improvements, but within a simplified model. So, as I mentioned before, Substrate is now production ready, and as of Unreal 5.7, it's on by default in new projects. So when you open or upgrade an existing project, the engine will automatically configure itself to run with Substrate support. But it's important to understand what that actually means. When you upgrade, your existing materials still use legacy shading models, but they're now backed internally by Substrate's data structures. So, nothing visually changes unless you edit the material, but it's running on the new system under the hood. Most importantly, This setup means that Substrate can be toggled on and off safely, as long as you haven't added any Substrate-specific nodes. But the moment you add nodes like slab or a composition operator, or if you explicitly convert a material by right-clicking on the base material attributes, that material is now bound to Substrate. If you disable Substrate after that, those nodes will be stripped and the material will lose its parameter assignments. So once you opt in at the graph level, it's a one-way trip for that material. The key takeaway here is that Substrate's upgrade path is intentionally safe and incremental. You can start using Substrate in small ways, adopt it gradually, and transition only the materials that benefit from the new system without breaking your project. Now that we're operating in Substrate, let's take a look at what a Substrate material actually is. Unlike legacy materials, which are defined by selecting a fixed shading model, Substrate materials are constructed from slabs. A slab is the fundamental building block of a Substrate material. You can think of it heuristically as a closure, in the sense that Substrate operators treat slabs as atomic units when blending or stacking them. But in reality, a slab is more than that. It's a bundled representation of multiple closures, essentially a shading model in its own right. It's designed to be the minimum viable struct to describe a unit of matter in a physically grounded, parameterized way. Even a single slab is more expressive than any of the legacy shading models. In fact, it's a replacement for 7. The slab can also represent material behaviors that would have required shader customization or tech art tricks in the past. Every slab is composed of 2 core components, an interface and a medium. And together, these define how light interacts with the material, both at the surface and within the volume. So let's dim out the inputs that aren't actually a part of the interface. The slab interface defines how light interacts with the material at the surface before it enters the volume. It's physically parameterized and built around 2 key attributes. F0, that is your reflectance at normal incidence to the camera, and roughness, which controls the spread of the highlight. Together, these describe what we would traditionally think of as the specular response of the material. One of the most important distinctions in Substrate is that F0 is a color. That means that any material, not just metallics, can exhibit chromatic specular, including dielectrics like chitin and oxide or oil films. There's even a helper node to aid in generating a reasonable F0 and F90 for these materials. The interface is also energy conserving by design. So when F0 increases, diffuse response is automatically reduced, keeping the total reflected energy physically consistent and saving you from manually balancing specular and diffuse strength. Substrate also supports F90, which you would probably expect to define grazing angle reflectance. This isn't quite the case. Even though F90 accepts a color input, it's not actually interpreted as a color value. Instead, it's handled as a hue and saturation shift relative to F0. This is mostly done for performance reasons, although if you do need a finer grain control of the Fresnel curve, a specular profile asset could be used instead. The interface also supports several opt-in features that allow you to build more complex light interactions when needed, including anisotropy, fuzz, secondary roughness, glints, specular profile, which is assigned to the slab directly, and rough refraction. If you don't use these features, there's no performance cost. The system is designed to be efficient by default. Now that we've looked at how the slab interface handles light at the surface, let's talk about the slab medium, which describes what happens beneath the surface. This part of the slab governs volumetric light transport, and it's what enables Substrate to represent traditional diffuse surfaces, subsurface scattering, and translucent or semi-transparent materials. You can think of the medium as the internal makeup of a material. It determines how light scatters, absorbs, or otherwise moves through the volume. The medium is parameterized by diffuse albedo, which is the internal color of the volume, thickness, which is how deep light travels into the material, and mean free path, or MFP, which is the average distance light travels before scattering, which is another way of saying changing direction or energy. These parameters drive the scattered luminance for the slab, enabling realistic rendering of materials like skin, wax, or soft plastics. I'd also like to clarify a few key points about MFP. It's spatially varying, which means you can texture map it, unlike the traditional subsurface scattering profiles, which are held constant. It's unbounded, so an MFP of 0 means fully opaque, but extremely large values can simulate clear, low scattering media. Large MFP values do come with the caveat that on opaque materials, they can cause noisy or incorrect results, so they're best used with translucent materials. If you want to mimic the behavior of some legacy subsurface scattering properties, there is an enumeration on the slab that will let you toggle the various SSS types, which is wrap, diffusion, and volume. And if parameterizing the MFP directly is unintuitive, you can use the transmittance to mean free path helper to drive it in a more intuitive fashion. And here's another quick look back at the schematic view of the slab, with the parameters color-coded according to their component, as well as noting the order in which they are dropped during material simplification. All right, before we jump into building with slabs, let's quickly look at the materials that aren't built from them, the ones that remain monolithic or are bound to specific material domains. At the top of the slide, you can see a few examples of domain materials. These are directly analogous to their legacy equivalents, and when used with Substrate, the appropriate material domain and shading model are automatically set for you. Domain materials are isolated. They can't be composed with Substrate operators, but they still benefit from running inside the Substrate pipeline. This includes post-process materials, light functions, and decals. When using Substrate, any material graph can be used as a decal. Just insert the Convert to Decal node before connecting to the front material input to ensure correct interpretation. At the bottom of the slide, we can also see examples of monolithic materials. As before, these materials are intended to be used in isolation. They represent complex, standalone phenomena where material blending either doesn't make sense or would be too expensive. Examples of this include volumetric, hair, eye, unlit, and single-layer water. All of these are considered monolithic and will not respond to Substrate blending operators. These non-composable materials still play a role, but most of what you'll create in Substrate starts with slabs, the core building blocks of the system. For me, operators are the core of what makes Substrate so powerful, the ability to define an arbitrary material topology. So when I say material topology, I'm referring to the arrangement of slabs and composition operators that determine how light interacts with a material, both at the surface and through its volume. It's the structure that defines how different closures combine to produce the final shading result. In many shading systems, materials are presented as closure trees or BSDF diagrams. They're schematic layouts that describe how lobes like diffuse, specular, fuzz, and transmission are organized. With Substrate, you're not locked into a predefined model. You build the topology yourself in the material graph. By choosing slabs, defining how they're composed, and structuring that logic explicitly, you control the range of materials your graph can represent. We're already starting from a more expressive baseline, and the ability to compose multiple slabs on top of that is intentional. Substrate is designed to scale with hardware, with rendering paths, and with your project. All that said, it's definitely possible to build topologies that are too costly for your target platform. The more closures you evaluate, the higher the cost, especially on ray tracing paths like lumen or path tracing. For lumen specifically, Substrate opts for the most performant behavior, even when hit lighting is enabled, by using the fully simplified material. However, it is still the case that all of the inputs need to be evaluated when generating that material. So while this flexibility is one of Substrate's greatest strengths, it needs to be used with care. Design your topologies intentionally, build what you need, and no more. And if you can get away with a single slab, do it. That's almost always going to be the most efficient option. We'll walk through the core composition operators next. Vertical coat, horizontal blend, add, coverage, and select, and look at how each contributes to material topology. Let's start with the vertical coat operator, one of Substrate's most powerful and unique features. This operator is used to represent physical layering, where one material fully or partially coats another. It simulates how light enters a top slab, interacts with it, so scatters, absorbs, or refracts, and then continues to the underlying slab. One important detail: for light to reach the lower slab, the top material must be transmissive. In practice, this means it needs a non-zero mean-free path. If the MFP is undefined or zero, the top layer is considered opaque and the base slab will not be evaluated. Two key parameters control the behavior here: mean-free path, which controls the color of the coat, and thickness, which controls how much light is lost to absorption. Together, these determine how much light makes it to the lower layer and how that light is filtered, tinted, or scattered along the way. This is the operator that allows Substrate to model things like layered scattering, where multiple slabs have different scattering properties, like some sophisticated skin shading models. Roughness modification, when the appropriate project setting is set, which involves applying a rough outer layer to soften the appearance of a glossy base. And chromatic attenuation, simulating color filtering through materials like resin, tinted water, or glass. What makes this operator stand out is that it supports stacking, so you can add multiple transmissive layers, and they'll interact with light in physically plausible ways. This is, in my view, one of the things that sets Substrate apart from nearly every other material system. The ability to handle complex coating behavior, for example, water on top of a clear-coated car paint, with mostly correct visual and physical results. Next up is the horizontal blend. This is the operator used for side-by-side transitions between slabs across a surface. It's probably easiest to think of this as a lerp or mix operation between materials. Horizontal blend takes two slabs and interpolates their shading result based on a blend input, which is typically a scalar, texture, or procedural mask. Here's the key performance detail. If the blend factor is 0 or 1, only one slab is evaluated. If the blend factor is non-unitary, meaning it falls between 0 and 1, both slabs are evaluated in full, and their outputs are interpolated. So the performance cost is tied to the size and complexity of the blend region. In particular, the tiles where that blend value is non-unitary. This makes horizontal blend generally cheaper than vertical coat, but still something to use thoughtfully, especially when you're blending large or complex slabs. This next group of operators is a little bit more specialized, and you won't reach for them nearly as often as vertical coat or horizontal blend, but they do fill in some important gaps. I'm going to say this up front. The add operator should generally not be used. It exists in Substrate mostly for completeness, but in most cases, it is more likely to cause problems than to solve them, primarily by breaking energy conservation. So what it does is really simple. It just adds together the results of two evaluated closures. That means that if you're summing their contributions directly post-evaluation, if both slabs are reflecting or scattering light, this will almost always result in more energy being reflected than hit the surface. The only physically accurate use case for add is when one of the materials is purely emissive. In that case, you're combining light emission from one closure with the reflective or transmissive response of another, and that's fine. But beyond that, it's nearly always a bad idea. So, unless you're working on a stylized effect or know exactly what you're doing, my advice is to avoid add entirely. The next operator up is coverage, and it works a little differently from others we've seen. Rather than blending or selecting between two slabs, coverage operates on a single slab and acts as a weighting function, controlling how much that slab contributes to the final material. Let's take a quick example using a translucent material. With Substrate, translucency allows independent control over chromatic surface response, transmittance, and coverage. In this case, we'll drive coverage with a height map. As you can see, the material only appears where the mask is non-zero, and partial coverage is respected smoothly, not discretely. I tend to think of coverage as assigning a probability that a slab exists at any given pixel. At 0, it contributes nothing. At 1, it's evaluated fully. Anywhere in between, it contributes proportionally. This makes coverage especially useful for attenuating a slab before it's composed, as is often the case with vertical coat, where you might want a spatially varying top layer. It's also useful in translucent materials where the coverage can provide masking or fading. The final operator in the set, and also the most recent addition, is select. This operator serves a few distinct purposes, but at its core, it enables conditional evaluation of one slab or another based on a selector input, and outputs a single slab, which can be very useful for performance control. So let's go back to our original example materials. You can see that the selection mask is actually used to pick either one material or the other, and offers no possibility of evaluating both closures, as is indicated by the ternary statement. In plain language, the statement reads, if the selection mask is greater than a value of 0.5, return material B, else return material A. Select is especially useful when you need to switch between shading models that can't be blended traditionally. One way to do this is to use a dithered evaluation combined with temporal anti-aliasing to produce a perceptually smooth result, even though only one slab is evaluated per frame. This makes it one of the only ways to blend certain features that are incompatible with horizontal blend, such as slabs using different subsurface profile assets. Together, these operators round out your material topology toolset, giving you more options for logic, optimization, and special case shading behaviors. All right, now that we've walked through the operator set, at this point, you're probably pretty reasonably telling yourself, well, that sounds pretty expensive. And you're probably right. So let's take a moment to talk about how to use these operators responsibly. Because the power that Substrate gives you can easily become a performance problem if you don't think carefully about material topology. It's worth reminding ourselves that a single slab is already more expressive than anything in the legacy shading model. If you can get the result you want with one slab, use one. Only reach for composition when you're combining distinct surface behaviors that genuinely require it. And while this may seem obvious, I'd like to explicitly restate, minimizing the number of slabs and limiting the depth of your operator tree can make your material significantly more efficient. Most crucially, strive to use parameter blending on your operators wherever possible, as it's one of the most impactful optimizations available in Substrate. When enabled, this feature allows an operator to blend input parameters before evaluating the slab, instead of evaluating both slabs and blending the results. So you only evaluate one slab per pixel, dramatically reducing the total number of closure evaluations, and it doesn't count towards the 8 closure limit. Quickly glancing at the examples on this slide shows both the visual results of enforcing parameter blending and the effect on material topology. You can see in the material on the left that we're using a fully simplified topology, where all operators are using parameter blending. This gives us a good approximation of the final look while keeping the material as performant as possible. But you can see it's a rougher visual match compared to the full topology shown on the far right. The middle material represents a more balanced approach, a topology that better preserves the visual intent while still optimizing for performance. Here we've applied parameter blending strategically in areas where it has the least visual impact, but still helps us meet performance goals. Now that we've seen how topology affects performance and visual fidelity, let's take a closer look at how parameter blending behaves in different operators. All operators in Substrate support parameter blending, but the visual impact varies depending on the operator. Let's start with horizontal blend, shown on the left. With parameter blending enabled, it produces results that are reasonably close to full evaluation. The transition remains smooth, and for most materials, it's a highly effective optimization. Now compare that to vertical coat, shown on the right. In this case, parameter blending changes the shading result much more noticeably. Since only one slab is evaluated per pixel, you lose layered light transport, including transmission, attenuation, and depth effects. To work around this, Substrate uses a heuristic approximation. It's efficient, but it's not physically correct. So if accuracy matters, you'll generally want to avoid parameter blending with the vertical coat. That said, on platforms that don't support multiple closures, or in performance-critical cases, this may be your only viable fallback. This behavior may also be previewed in the material editor using the Substrate panel. Lastly, keep in mind that parameter blending must be consistent throughout the graph. Once an operator uses it, all operators beneath it in the topology must also use it. So this isn't something you retrofit. You need to design for it from the outset. Before we wrap, I want to take a moment to talk about where this is all going and why Substrate isn't just a new material model, but a foundation for where Unreal is headed long term. Substrate isn't just a shading upgrade, it's a conceptual shift in how we author materials. By structuring materials around slabs, parameterized interfaces, and explicit composition logic, Substrate gives us a framework that's more physically accurate, more modular, and more adaptable to future workflows. Substrate is designed to work across a wide range of rendering contexts, from mobile devices, high-end real-time applications, to offline path tracing. Even future platforms that haven't been fully defined yet. It's built to scale with hardware, with graph complexity, and with team workflows. Substrate also opens the door to stronger interoperability with external shader systems and open standards. As standards like OpenPBR continue to develop, Substrate is positioned to represent and exchange data cleanly with those models through interchange, offering a clear path towards broader pipeline integration. So that brings us to the end. We've taken our materials from this to this. So I want to take a moment to recap what we've covered and leave you with a few key takeaways. So Substrate is a new approach to authoring shading models in Unreal, and it should be thought of as a framework to fit your needs. Instead of selecting shading models, you now construct material topologies using slabs and composition operators. Even a single slab can be more expressive than a full legacy material, and that's often the best place to start. Substrate supports powerful combinations of closures, but each additional operator and slab has a cost, and structure matters. Parameter blending is your best optimization tool, so use it early and plan for it. Your material graph is now your shading model, and that gives you both creative control and technical responsibility. Substrate adapts to hardware constraints automatically, letting you create high-end materials that degrade for various targets without duplication. And Substrate is enabled by default in 5.7, and legacy materials remain compatible until you opt in, giving you full control over adoption. Substrate gives you the flexibility to build incredible materials, but also the responsibility to manage complexity. If you're thoughtful about how you compose, structure, and optimize, this system gives you the tools to author materials that are scalable and maintainable across teams, projects, and platforms. So whether you're a solo dev, an indie team, or part of a large studio, Substrate gives you the flexibility to build and maintain a material system that works for you, and one that evolves as your project and platform needs grow. So thanks for your time and attention, and we got a bit of time for questions.
Hi, everybody. I'm Camille Kay, a technical artist on the developer relations team at Epic Games, and today I'm going to be talking with you about Unreal Materials, new features, and productivity enhancements. So here's an overview of what we'll be covering today. Starting with 5.6, we'll dive right into the many quality of life updates that we've added to the materials system this year. It'll be rather rapid fire, but like I said, it'll all be on EDC afterwards. And then I'll cover 5.7 updates, which are available as of today for you to tinker with in the preview. And these two sections will be the bulk of the material that we cover. After that, I'll talk a bit about Substrate, the new default in 5.7, and then I'll share a sneak peek of what's next for the material system after that. From there, I'll highlight a few other talks at Fest that you might be interested in, since we're right at the start of the show. And then we'll wrap up with that resource link I mentioned, and if we have some time, some Q&A. So let's get into it. Earlier this year, we released Unreal Engine version 5.6. It reflects a major push by the material dev team to tackle new features, and like I said, a lot of quality of life improvements. These changes will hopefully make a noticeable and positive difference in your day-to-day usage of the material system. So let's start with the new node. The Convert node is a time and space saver. It's a powerful, flexible node with all sorts of use cases, and it provides a more compact and direct interface for make, break, and swizzling operations in materials. So you know how you'd sometimes need to stack like a bunch of append nodes to get the data how you wanted it to be? No more. We are freed. The Convert node handles all of that in one place, reducing clutter and improving readability. It also helps with iteration times as well. So to use this node, all you got to do is open the right-click menu and search for Convert. You'll see a list of related presets, such as Make Vector 3 and Break Float 4, which are up here. But there's also an option that's just called Convert. And if you select it, you'll just get this simple node in the graph with no pins preset, only the options to add inputs and add outputs. So click on either of those plus icons, and you can select which type of pins you want. So we've got Scalar, Vector 2, Vector 3, and Vector 4. And the node supports adding multiple inputs of whatever types you want on both sides. So in this example, on the input side, I have a scalar input, a vector 3, and a vector 2. And on the output, I've got a vector 2 and a vector 3. So these nodes are flexible, like I said, and you can add and delete pins as you wish. Just right-click on the pin you want to remove and select Delete Pin. Do note, it's the Delete Pin option, not delete, because that will just delete the whole node. And here are some quick examples of how this can be used. So you can change the order from RGBA to BRGA. You can make a float 3 from separate scalar parameters. You can swizzle together data using different types of inputs, like this vector 2 in a scalar. You can also split vectors into individual floats. And worth noting is that you can just specify values directly in the node. You don't have to have pins connecting things. So in this example, there's a scalar input set to 0 without an external wire, and an output pin set to 3 without an internal wire. And so the resulting vector would be 103. So let's talk about some shortcuts, and not the kind that get you lost in a new city. So for starters, we've made some improvements to reroute nodes. So thinking back to 5.5, if I wanted to create a reroute usage node for a reroute that I've already declared, like the one here, I'd right-click in the graph, search for it by name, select the one I want from the list. So this process is fine, but it could be faster, could be better. In 5.6, also, you can still do it this way. It's ideal for when the reroute node is like somewhere far off screen and you just want to get to it. However, if you have it in view, we have an alternative where you don't have to do this. So instead, you can just right-click on the reroute node, select the Create Reroute Usage option, and ta-da, reroute node, easy peasy. Additionally, there's now a way to easily find and navigate to named reroutes that you've already created. So let's say we made a few more in the graph, and so I could just right-click on the named reroute declaration, choose Select Named Reroute Usages, and the Find Results tab will have a list of all the things that have been made derived from it. So click on any of these listed node names, and then the graph will highlight whichever one you've just selected. Way easier to find stuff. We also have a new jump to node definition shortcut. This brings this in parity with blueprints. So for this example, I have a vector parameter in the material attribute space color. I can just right-click on the node to open the menu, and then select the new Go to Definition option, give your IDE a chance to load up, and ta-da, code. You'll see the relevant file. Next up, we have the Preview button and shortcut. So up until 5.6, the only way to preview a node was to right-click on it and select Start Previewing Node. When you're trying to do this rapid fire to compare stuff, it can be a little clunky. As of 5.7, all nodes now have a Preview button in the title bar, right next to the expand and collapse icon. So just click on that, and the preview will activate. If you're not already familiar with this feature, Preview shows the results of whatever parts of the graph are connected to the selected node, as if the selected node were plugged into the base color material attribute. It's super helpful for debugging and iteration. You can also preview a node via the new keyboard shortcut. Hover over any node, you don't even have to click on it, and then press Shift and Space. This further reduces the number of clicks you need to preview your work. The team also put together a new shortcut for connecting new nodes. So in 5.5 and earlier, you'd either need to drag out a wire from the existing node, search for it, select it, there you go. Or you'd search for and create the nodes separately, and then manually drag a wire between them. But now, in 5.6, you can select an existing node, right-click somewhere in the graph to open up the context menu, and just highlight the node that you want, arrow keys, mouse, whatever you want. Then hold Shift while either clicking on the menu option or pressing Enter. And this will create a new node in that spot, automatically connected to the previously selected thing without having to fiddle with dragging out a wire. So next, in 5.6, double-clicking on the name of a parameter in the Parameters tab will now select and focus the graph on the material node that it comes from. And this works with both materials and material functions. If the parameter is defined in a subfunction or a different material asset, it'll open that corresponding asset, select the node in the new editor. And if the asset is already open, the editor will switch to that tab or window and focus on the node there. So in this example, I'm just clicking through different parameter names, and you can see that the graph responds accordingly. Next up, we have improvements to live updates, the engine's ability to show the visual results of changes in real time without waiting for manual saves, reopens, or manual recompilations. The first of these three changes we'll cover is live in-panel parameter editing, so fresh in 5.6. A scrubbed value in the details panel will now also update within the node and the material preview at the same time. It's great. Gone are the days of using material instances just to hone in on parent material values, so definitely a productivity boost that I was excited about. And in the same vein of things, parameter changes will now be reflected in the material layer instance thumbnails as well. So this brings material layers into parity with regular old material instances. It helps keep visual consistency between what's in the viewport and what's in the content browser, makes life easier. And the last one of this set, live material instance updates via the editing library. So when setting material instance parameters via the material editing library, the material instance editor will now show those updated visuals without manual recompiles or saves. And you can change those parameters via Python or blueprints. As you can see in the example here, the values are being set via a Python script in that background window. And the preview updates accordingly. So in 5.6, the dev team has also made some improvement to searches. When searching for nodes in the right-click context menu in 5.5 and earlier, the search weighting would sometimes prioritize less intuitive results. So for example, searching for object posé would highlight the object scale material function instead of what I actually wanted. Now in 5.6, this same search will highlight the object position WS node, which is what I wanted. The search results are based on weighted information, including the node's title, description, category, etc., which are set in the editor preferences. And title matches are now weighted more heavily than they used to be. You're also further welcome to tinker with these settings to best suit your needs as well. In 5.6, keywords are now included in property searches. So let's say as someone new to Unreal, I wanted to enable this displacement pin in the material attributes. In 5.5, if I went to the details panel and searched for displace, I'd get some settings about it, but nothing about actually enabling it. So we've noticed that this sort of thing has been a sticking point for folks, so we've made some changes in 5.6. If I put in that same exact search, the results now include enable tessellation, which is the setting that you'd need. The details panel will now search the keywords meta specifier. So that's the main change here. Previously, only blueprints and variables would take these keywords into account. So now there's feature parity. And this change also includes adding that displacement keyword onto the enable tessellation option in the materials. So next up, the parameters within a material parameter collection are now searchable in the material editor. So if I drag and drop a material parameter collection into the graph, create an MPC node, go to the details panel, click on the parameter name, and I can see all of my options. In this example, I have a lot of very similarly named parameters, so scrolling and manually picking out the proper one might be tedious or just prone to error. So instead, I can now type a query into the search bar, and the list will filter out the results appropriately. This should make it much faster and easier to find and select what you want. Next, the material editor settings module is now registered at engine startup. This affects whether the things you search for show up. So in 5.5, if you went to the editor preferences before opening any materials in that engine session, the material editor settings, they were just missing. So you'd have to go out of your way to open up a material asset before actually getting access to your options in the GUI. So in 5.6, this has been fixed. The material editor module is now included in the settings list automatically. And to wrap up this section about 5.6, we have some miscellaneous updates to share. So as of 5.6, texture sample nodes now support custom channel names. So in the graph, you can select your texture sample node and open the details panel. In the expandable section labeled parameter customization, there are 4 fields, RGB and A. Type what you wish into the fields, and they'll be reflected in the node next to their respective pin. Any fields with custom data will use that specific text, and any fields without it will just use the default as the fallback. These fields can also be localized, so just click on the flag icon to see your options. And this feature is super helpful for teams that really want to better support and enforce packed texture mask orders throughout their projects. The view near plane is now included as an option in the view property node. So you can get to this by adding a view property node into your graph, use the drop-down icon to expand the node, open that drop-down menu, and you can select view near plane right at the bottom of the list. And the node will change to reflect it. So if I scoot this over, we can talk about it a bit. The view near plane value is the same as the near clip plane setting. You can check and set this using CVARs like I have here. You can also take a look at these sorts of outputs by using the debug scalar values nodes. These are great, super useful for prototyping and iteration. So hook that up to something like the base color and apply the material to an object in the level, and you'll see the values match up. So this view near property node is particularly useful for things like fading translucent VFX, like floating dust or snow, before they clip into the camera. We've also added mixed subsurface implementation options for balancing quality with performance needs. So in subsurface profile assets, there's a new option in the Burley normalized section called implementation. There's a drop-down menu here with 2 options, adaptive filtered importance sampling and separable. AFIS is the higher quality option, and it's great for important assets like the subsurface scattering on the skin of a hero character. Separable is the more performant option, which is more useful for assets with less important subscattering needs, but you still want some, such as snow. And we used this feature earlier this year for one of our demos. The last update in 5.6 is actually one of my favorites, comment box alignment. So as much as I love productivity boosts, and I do, I really love well-aligned graphs. So I'll highlight the grid here. Creating a comment, especially when using the C key shortcut, would result in a box that wasn't quite grid aligned. And this would cause a cascade of misalignment issues with nodes that would have to be fixed manually. And it is my joy to share in 5.6, this is no longer the case. Yeah! So here's that grid highlighted again in 5.6. Look at it, it's beautiful. The comment box, perfection. All right, so that wraps up the 5.6 updates. And now we can take a look at what's new in 5.7. So these are the changes that you can start tinkering with in the preview. And first off, we'll start again with 2 new experimental nodes. So these are the motion vector world offset per pixel node. It's a bit of a tongue twister, bear with me, and the temporal responsiveness node. Both of these were developed to help solve some of the smearing issues with certain materials when using TSR. So let's take a closer look at the motion vector world offset per pixel node, which I'll refer to as MVW, new thing. Without any modifications, like we showed before, this is what a material can look like when using TSR. It has pretty severe ghosting problems, not ideal. We can somewhat address this by using previous frame switch. It definitely improves the output, but we end up with some smearing in the middle due to like slightly inaccurate motion vector situation. So in contrast, here's what the MVWO node looks like in action. Much clearer visuals. So how's this material set up? The gist of it is, without going through absolutely everything, for the rings, we used your usual texture coordinate, time, mathy stuff, plug it into the base color, great. Then we calculate the delta UV per frame, convert from delta UV to WPO based on the size of the mesh, and then plug that into the MVWO node. Ta-da! So while working with this node, it'll probably be helpful to take a look at what's going on with the motion vectors in your scene. So to do so, you can use r.motionblur.visualize, set to 1, or you can turn on a more colorful view, which is brand new, showflag.visualizeMotionBlur, set it to 1, good to go, you'll get this visual. And here's some other last important notes about the motion vector world offset per pixel node. It's a bit expensive compared to the other one that we'll look at, so just be mindful of it. It provides a higher quality motion vector, better than the previous frame switch as we saw earlier, and better history stability. It's not compatible with Nanite, and it's great for anything that has pixel animation with like known motion vectors, such as water simulation. So let's take a look at the experimental temporal responsiveness node. Without any modifications, this is what the material with fast animating text might look like when using TSR, right? You've got that ghosting, that smearing issue. We can somewhat address this by using has pixel animation. It's pretty good, but there's still some slight issues with it. It could be better. And this is what the temporal responsiveness node looks like when it's in use. Nice and crisp. As for the material's implementation of the temporal responsiveness node, let's take a quick look. Up top, we've got some custom code to figure out which digits are changing. And then we selectively mask out the regions where the digits are changing. And then the combined results are multiplied with a scalar responsiveness parameter and piped into the temporal responsiveness node. The TR node has 3 discrete levels. Default is 0, so normal temporal accumulation, no changes being made. Then we've got medium, 0 to 0.5. It assumes medium level mismatch of motion vectors for pixel animation and rejects the temporal history more aggressively, especially for small features, but not completely. And the TR full is 0.5 to 1, and the motion vector is considered fully unreliable. The digits highlighted in red here show that, and you can take a look at this by using the TSR rejection weights view. A few final notes on the temporal responsiveness node. It is the cheaper of the 2 options. It has full non-nanite support with limited nanite support. One of the risks is that it can actually look a little jittery occasionally, depending on the use case. So we recommend using it selectively. And it's great for things like fast-changing text or video playing in a game. And next up, we've got node improvements for 5.7. One of the maybe less flashy, but I think helpful quality of life changes is that we removed autofocus when creating reroute nodes. So in 5.6, when you create a reroute node usage, it would cause the graph's view to move, and it would reset the graph's zoom setting, despite the usage node always appearing right next to the thing that you're working with. So in 5.7, the graph's position in the viewport won't change, and the zoom setting will no longer be reset. So it's a little more comfortable to use. We've also made improvements to the vector parameter node and its corresponding constant. So in 5.6, here's a vector parameter. For starters, the pins weren't labeled with anything. So for those with CVD, color blindness, it might be difficult to tell some of these pins apart from each other. And for folks who are new to Unreal, these gray and white pins, I don't know, right? They're not self-explanatory. So there were also 3 functionality issues. First, although the documentation and the pin type indicate that it's a vector 4, because it has 4 floats, the top pin only ever output 3 of the values. Folks might already be familiar with this little quirk. And the 4th value was just omitted. So users would need to manually, once again, the append node, append the alpha value to the RGB output to actually use all of the values in here. Also, when the vector 4 parameter was converted into a constant, it would turn into a vector 3 node. Same issue as the parameter, and the alpha value would get dropped entirely. So this could lead to data loss and unexpected node incompatibilities in the graph, as the expectation was that it would turn into a vector 4. Lastly, the converted constant node would always display 0 for the constant values, which would be a bit confusing, not ideal, rather than values from the parameter. So in 5.7, pins are labeled, removing ambiguity and making them more accessible. There's now an RGBA pin, providing a way to access the full vector 4 parameter without using an append. And converting this node to a constant results in a proper vector 4 node, fixing the data loss and type incompatibility issues. And the in-node value display is now a color picker, same as in the parameter. Do note that the RGBA is on the bottom of the parameter, but the top of the constant. This keeps things situated as they have been for the parameter, and the vector is the same as the other vectors. So, little quirk, but it's there and it's labeled. Another change to the vector 4 node, it now has custom parameter name fields that can be localized, just like the texture sample node in 5.6. In 5.7, we have an update for how channel mask parameters appear in instances. So in a 5.6 material instance, this mask parameter would be displayed on 2 separate lines, named the same thing. One was a dropdown and one was a color picker. Not super intuitive. So in 5.7, we've cleaned this up. It only displays a single option just with a dropdown. It's a little something that'll give you some more vertical space and clarity in your material instances. We also have some cool efficiency boosts in 5.7. We now have a much more automatic way to fix up mismatched sampler type errors. And it happens to everybody now and then, right? We're in our material, we connect a texture sample up to something, and oh no, error. We check the stats panel, and we're told that the sampler type doesn't match the texture. So at this point in 5.6, we'd open the details panel and manually change the value to the right thing. As of 5.7, we can instead open up the Clean Graph menu at the top, like so, and select Fix Up Mismatched Samplers. A message will pop up letting you know how many texture samplers would be affected, and it provides the option to continue or cancel the operation. If you confirm, ta-da! The sampler type has been changed to linear grayscale, you didn't have to pick it, and the node looks good, and the stats panel is happy. Next, 5.7 adds subsearch queries for material functions in the editor. It can pick up results buried within layers of functions, letting you know which nodes or related material functions have the search result inside of them. So in this example material, we have a material function. In the Find Results panel, let's say I search for layer 2. If I single click on this result, the material function will be focused in the graph. If I double click on that result, it'll open up the material function that the result is inside of. And from there, I can follow the search to that material function and to the layer 2 scalar parameter that I was originally searching for. One of the coolest new interactions that we have lined up for 5.7 is the new Slice to Disconnect shortcut. All right. So to get to this, press the Alt key, left mouse button at the same time, and then drag across whatever wires you want to disconnect. They'll show up dimmed before you release to let you know which ones you're affecting. And note that this is just a straight point A to point B line. It's not a wiggly freeform draw thing. And next up, we have 2 tag feature updates. 5.7 introduces the also a bit of a tongue twister, has static permutation resource asset registry tag. So in the content browser, you'll be able to hover over any material instance and see whether or not it's been labeled as has static permutation resource true or false. If true, this means the material instance has elements that may cause permutations when used, such as static switch parameters or base property overrides. In this example, parent material, we have a vector parameter, let's say a texture sample, and we pop in a static switch parameter to decide which of these two we want to use for the base color. And the default value is true. And the static switch is a potential source of permutations, which of course can have performance costs, so it's good to know about them. So in the content browser, we can take a look at this first material instance, and we can see that has static permutation resource is false. In the material instance, the switch parameter, totally left alone. There's no change to the default, no expected risk of permutation from it. And we can compare this to the next material. Has static permutation resource is set to true. In this asset, the switch parameter has been marked as editable, and the value is different from the default, therefore, tag is true. But this last one's a little different. May have been a bit of a surprise for folks. So lastly, we have this material instance is set to true, but it looks like it's using the default value, right? So if I open this up, I am using the default value, but I've also marked it as editable. And so it's flagging the potential for this to be a permutation source that you need to care about. Next up, we have a new asset tag management system. So this is available on all asset types, but it also affects materials. So I'm going to go over it here since it's shiny and new and exciting. So to access this manager, go to your content browser, right-click, and select Manage Tags from the menu. That'll bring up the Manage Tags window. You can also use Control-T to open this up. In the first section at the top left, you can see which asset or assets are currently selected. And below that, we have the Owned Tags section, which includes all the tags associated with that specific asset. Within that section, there's an Add Tag option. Type, hit the button, it gets applied. And on the right, we have the Material Project Tags. So this refers to tags at the project level associated with the material asset type. So to add tags within this section, you go to the project settings window, go to the editor section, user asset tag settings, use the plus icon in the user asset tags per type section, and add assets to the list. In this case, I selected the material asset type and the Niagara system asset type, just for funsies. And in the material section, I created a new asset tag called material tag. Very exciting names, I know. So back in our Manage Tag window, I can check the material tag box, which will then add it to the Owned Tags section, meaning it's now associated with that specific asset. In the content browser, I can also select more than one asset at a time. So these are both materials, but you can select assets of different types as well if you'd like. The selected asset section will now reflect that. And the Owned Tag section will reflect all of the tags associated with all of those selected assets. A dashed checkbox in any of these means that the tag is only used in some but not all of the assets selected. So in this case, material tag is used by example material, but not by example 2. If I click on one of those dashes, that tag will be applied to all the selected assets. To show this, the material project tag goes from a dash to a check mark, and the relevant tag in the owned section has the dash removed to show that it's on all of them now. One other helpful feature with this is favorites. So if you click on an empty star icon, the icon will fill in, and that tag will be added to the local asset type favorites section. So if nothing is favorited, this section won't be visible. It appears when you favorite something for the first time. As shown here, the one called first tag is included in this new list, and it's the same dash checkbox indicating that it's not on all selected assets. If I go back to the content browser and select only the example 2 material, we can see the first tag that I favorited is still listed in that favorites section. This is because it's associated with the type of asset and it's local. So if I had a Niagara asset selected instead, this section wouldn't show up. If I have a favorite that isn't already applied, I can just check the box. and that'll easily stick it onto the asset that's selected, so it makes it super quick to add tags to other material assets later in production. These tags can technically be used for searches too, might be helpful. So let's say you wanted to find all the assets that with a tag that you made in project settings, like this material tag I made earlier. And so in the search bar, you could type uat.material tag equals ... In our example here, the results would be the two example materials with this tag applied. Basically, the content browser asset registry always assumes that a tag is a key value pair, but the tags are like just keys, so to speak. So the content browser will pick up on the key and provide autocomplete, but it's up to you to type in a value after it, like equals at least something. But they only have empty values, so it just needs equals ... So this was originally developed for the tagged asset browser that appears when you create a new Niagara system or emitter. Tags are shown up in the corner here, which filter the assets accordingly. So you can use these to author asset registry tag-based systems. You can use it during runtime to query and use assets in UI or other stuff. Basically, wherever a gameplay system wants to treat assets based on some innate property of the asset, you can just use these user asset tags to manage these properties. All right, so we have an update to material parameter collections in 5.7. As of this version, you can now override material parameter collections inside material instances. So let's talk about it. For this example, I've made a material parameter collection called base, and within the asset, I've defined one parameter, base scalar, set to 0.1. I dragged and dropped this asset into my graph, hooked it up to my roughness pin, and in the details panel, set the NPC to use this specific parameter. I get a shiny sphere. Yay. Next, I'll create another material parameter collection asset called derived NPC. Might see where this is going. In the asset, we have the usual material parameters section, settings that you're used to, and right below that, there's an option called base. I've assigned the base NPC that was added, to that parent material earlier. And in this section, I changed the base scalar parameter from in there from 0.1 to 1. So next up, I create a material instance based on that parent material. And as shown here, there's a new section called parameter collection overrides. And I can mark this for editing, then assign the derived NPC from the dropdown. So the result? The sphere went from a shiny roughness of 0.1 to a matte roughness of 1, demonstrating that the value has successfully overridden what was in the base NPC. So this is something that will allow for even more flexible, dynamic, controllable visuals, and I'm really excited to see what stuff you'll make and manage with this new feature. As of 5.7, Unreal Engine also has a new tool. It's a material diff tool. So to access this feature, go to a material that you want, right-click on the asset, and hover over diff against, then select whichever asset that you want to compare it to. And this will open up the material diff window. Let's take a look at what's here. In the top left corner, we have a list of changes and arrow buttons to step through them. Changes are written out and color-coded. So red is for removals, green for additions, cyan for moved links, and gray is for moved nodes. These colors are reflected in the graph view as well. So just like with regular material graphs, you can drag and zoom within the views. And by default, the graphs are set to locked. So this means that if you move one, the other will move with it, so the view is matched. You can compare things a little more easily. You can also unlock this if you wish. We also have the option to view this as a horizontal layout rather than a vertical layout. And in the lower portion of the window, there's a comparison of the material settings along with material viewports for visual previews. So this should help parse material changes much more efficiently. Okay, we're going to round out our coverage today by talking about one of the big changes, Substrate. So Substrate will be the new default for all materials in 5.7. The legacy material system provided a fixed suite of shading models and blend modes, such as default lit and clear coat and all those. With Substrate, that will no longer be the case. Materials in Substrate are conceptualized as slabs of matter These slabs are principled BSDF, so bidirectional scattering distribution function representation, parameterized by physical quantities with well-defined units, replacing some of the abstractions of the legacy material system. So this makes it possible to more accurately blend between discrete surface types like metal, glass, and plastic. Substrate also streamlines the process of layering materials, making it easier to represent surfaces like liquid on metal or clear coat over subsurface. In short, Substrate is a fundamental change to the technical structure of materials and provides more visually accurate rendering results. Because of their principal representation, substrate materials can be simplified according to the capacity of a platform in order to trade visual quality for performance. Related to this, in project settings, you'll be able to set the substrate gbuffer format to either adaptive gbuffer or blendable gbuffer. Substrate's adaptive gbuffer is the fully featured substrate option, so it enables complex lighting behavior per pixel and is the heavier option because of it. It supports debuffer decals, and it's compatible with Shader Model 6 platforms. If you set the project to adaptive, then all platforms that support this gbuffer, based on any file settings and such, will be adaptive, whereas the rest will use the blendable gbuffer as the fallback. Substrate's blendable gbuffer is the more limited option. The trade-off here is that it has less lighting complexity, but because of it, it is the faster option. It retains the legacy gbuffer characteristics and handles substrate data through packed render targets, automatically simplifying it into a single slab. It also supports blendable decals. And if you set your project to blendable, that becomes the ceiling, and all projects will be blendable, even if they're SM6 and could have supported adaptive gbuffer instead. So keep that in mind. So to accompany the switch to Substrate, we'll be providing a new Substrate base material plugin. It's a big collection of material functions that can be used as starting points for explorations in Substrate. And that's a wrap for what's new in 5.7. So let's talk about what's next for materials in Unreal. So I'm excited to share that we are working on a new translator with an experimental release targeted for sometime next year. It'll be adding a new intermediate representation, or IR, which will result in better HLSL output and include some powerful new nodes and graph features, such as a new if-then-else node, an operator node, struct support, and type-colored pins and wires, shown here. This list is not complete, just a preview of some of what we started working towards, and I'll talk a little bit about these, and then we'll move towards wrapping up. So as far as HLSL improvements go, here's what's in the works. The future translator will have 3 panels for working with HLSL, shown here. It'll show you the previous translator's HLSL, the new translator's HLSL, and the intermediate representation. You'll also be able to display just the relevant code generated from the material graph instead of like all 4,000 lines of the material.usf. If you do want to look at the full source, though, you can get that from selecting one of the parameter platforms or shader models. And let's take a look at 2 of the nodes I mentioned. First up, we have the new if-then-else node. It'll feature proper branching, meaning that the unused option won't be evaluated. The current if node does not branch. Both sides are evaluated, even if only one is ultimately used, so this is definitely a plus up. The condition pin in this example is set by a static bool up there, but there'll also be an option to compare 2 values in another node and then use that result in the if node's condition pin. And then lastly, the future translator will support a new operator node, shown here just as add, making it even easier to switch between math operation types in place. So to use it, just click on the little arrow icon next to the node's title bar and select the desired operation from the list. The asset type will change in place, like I mentioned, and we have a lot of options that are in the works, including the ones pictured here, like frac, sign, not equals, bitwise, and more. And by clicking on the little plus icon, you'll be able to easily add extra input pins to the node as well. So you'll still be able to search for the individual operations in the main click graph menu, so we're not losing that. You don't have an extra step to go through. But this should really help iteration time, especially for tech artists that like to just tinker with mathy things to see what it does for cool visual effects. It should be a lot of fun to play with, and also just really convenient to iterate and make changes to. And that's the end of the sneak peek for the future. Before we close out the session, 2 more sections. So I'd like to take a moment to recognize the materials dev team at Epic that made these features possible this year. We've got Jason, Nathaniel, Tian, both Dans, Forrest, Mateo, Robert, Nick, and Jaden, along with our QA teammates, Bree and Alan. So and since you've attended this session about materials, I want to highlight some other talks here at Fest that might be of interest to you since we're right at the beginning of the show, like I said. These are all included at the link at the end of my presentation as well, so you can find these in the agenda in addition to that too. So first up, we've got Managing Unbounded Growth, a story of shaders in UE, today at 2:30 p.m. in room 5. It'll be presented by Dan Elksneres, a senior rendering programmer here at Epic Games. And then we've got Everything You Wanted to Know About Substrate, because I just touched on like a teeny bit of it, taking place tomorrow at 4 p.m. in room 8. It'll be presented by Nathaniel Morgan, a principal technical artist at Epic Games as well. And then if you'd like to hear more talks by folks on my team, the Technical Developer Relations team, we have 6 others, more were added, for you to check out. So first off, 101 Unreal Engine tips and tricks. This one has started already, but it goes on for like another hour and a half. And knowing those guys, there's a lot to talk about. They'll be there for a while. So catch it in room 4, presented by a group including Ari Ambjørnsen. Then we have an introduction to Horde, today at 4 p.m. in room 1 by Jack Condon. PCG, an introduction, use cases, and production best practices, today at 2:30 with Matt Ozdele. Profiling with Purpose, a performance analysis of a real Unreal project, tomorrow at 11:45 in room 5 with Ari and Matt. Creating debug tools with Slate IM, tomorrow at 2:30 in room 4, presented by Cody. And a tech artist guide to automated performance testing, tomorrow in room 1 with Matt once again. And there we go. Thank you so much for joining me today. Here's that QR code that I mentioned in case you're unable to see it or your phone isn't picking it up. It goes to linktree/SheDoesArtStuff. This page has all sorts of resources sorted by category. Relevant to this talk, it has a link to an EDC article about the 5.6 improvements, and it's also where I'll share the 5.7 resources closer to the full release date later this year. It also has additional content that the DevRel team, my team, has published. Helpful bits of documentation, more resources on the Epic developer community, some links to sample projects, and more stuff. I'm also on Blue Sky, an Epic developers community with the same name, She Does Art Stuff, and I'll post there and as I add new content to the link tree, so that's the easiest way to keep up with what's being added. I also will reshare and post a bunch of stuff that the cool folks at TDR and the rest of Epic and the community share as well. Last note is that I will be available at the Dev Hub after this presentation, so please do feel free to stop by, chat with me, chat with my colleagues after this talk. Also, if you don't get a chance to ask a question, because I will actually have like 5 minutes for questions, it's great. If you'd rather not, or don't get a chance to ask your question here, we can talk about it on the show floor as well. So with that said, thank you again, and let's start Q&A.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk. I know I'm up against nanite foliage, so I appreciate you all being here. I don't have a lot of eye candy. I do have some number candy, I guess, later on, which is going to be fun. Yeah, and this is my talk about what we're doing on the Unreal Engine team about the shader problem. My name is Dan Oxnidis. I work on the rendering architecture team. Our purview is primarily shader system, material system, that kind of thing. So let's get into it. Agenda for today. First, I want to just describe the motivation for some of the major changes we've made in the UE shader system over the past few engine releases. I'll give you some background information on the shader system in general, just stuff that's going to be helpful to know to understand the rest of the presentation's contents if you don't know it already. We'll get into a discussion of what leads to high shader counts and why we're dealing with constant unbounded growth in this space. Some strategies to reduce shader counts in your own projects without having to make any engine changes. Touch a little bit on the on-demand shader compilation mechanism that came around in UE5, early days of UE5. And then the bulk of the talk is going to be details about all the systemic improvements we made to the shader system between UE5.2 and now that have been attempting to deal with this problem. Then we'll get into the results, some cook stats, some numbers, and finally just a glimpse into some future work that we're going to continue to be addressing to just improve the situation systemically as best we can. So, motivation. What was the reason we took this work on in the first place? I imagine if you're here or you're watching this video after the fact, you're probably familiar with the shader system. You're familiar with massive shader counts, large amounts of compilation time, the problems that we've had for years and years and years. So most of what I'm going to talk about is specifically pertaining to cook times, so project cook times. If you care about that kind of thing, that's what I'm going to be digging into. So around middle of 2022, we'd kind of reached a breaking point internally. Cooks of some of our internal projects were frequently basically needing to recompile every single shader. In some cases, these cooks were timing out. When cooks timed out, that meant we didn't get QA builds. QA couldn't validate builds to get to content creators. It was just a huge workflow disruption. So it was bad times for everybody. Now, the main driver of this problem here was just frequent shader code changes from our rendering team, stressing the shader drive data cache mechanism, DDC we call it. So we're only caching full shader maps. Full shader maps generally contain tens to hundreds of shaders each. And the cache key of these shaders was based on a hash of all the source and a bunch of other settings that went into the shaders in that shader map. So this meant even trivial changes like changing white space or comments in a shader file could incur like a recompile of every single shader in the project. So, changes to like a comment.ush file meant every shader map's invalidated, every shader in the world's recompiling, which is obviously not great in a stream with active shader development. This meant, basically we're recompiling everything all the time, every day, multiple times a day, which is not great. So we had some temporary workarounds, but spoiler alert, they sucked. First of all, we had a shader submission Friday where shader devs were only permitted to submit shader code on Friday afternoons to allow the automated builds to catch up over the weekend. And you can imagine this did not really go over that well. It didn't last very long. We improved the situation a little bit by separating shader devs into a separate stream. Essentially, we had an automated CI process that was pulling in changes from main, churning through the content, pre-populating the shared DDC, and eventually merging that shader code back into the main line. But this just in practice meant long delays between the work being finished and getting into the hands of users. And often we'd get bad luck with a string of build health and we just have no progress on this process for days at a time. So it was just really not sustainable. So we formed a strike team to kind of tackle this problem from as many angles as possible. So the background information, probably some of you are aware of this already, so bear with me, it's not going to take very long. Just some stuff I'm going to refer to in the remainder of the talk. So first, I want to talk about the distinction between global and material shaders. So the global shaders are the ones that are all basically hand-coded HLSL, typically written entirely by a programmer, used for specific passes, compute tasks, that kind of thing, unrelated to scene objects, or not specifically attached to a scene objects, more accurately. Versus material shaders, which are things that are applied to objects in the scene. They're constructed from a combination of hand-coded HLSL and the material graphs that are translated in HLSL automatically. So what that means basically is that global shaders are not content dependent, while material shaders are content dependent. So in large projects, generally speaking, material shaders dominate compile time, cook time, etc. There are other categories of shaders as well. Niagara, Compute Framework, etc. do also generate shaders, but they're generally in practice, the numbers are much smaller, so they don't have the same impact on cook time, so I'm not going to really talk about those in this talk. So shader types, these are basically the C++ and HLSL code that are mashed together to generate shaders. Each implementation of shader type roughly maps to a single rendering pass in the engine. So for material shaders, you got things like your base passes, shadow pass, depth pass, velocity, etc. Where global shader types tend to be more things like post effects, lighting passes, full screen things, compute related stuff. We've also got vertex factories. These are further variations of shaders that deal with unpacking different types of vertex data, so meshes, particles, hair, water, that kind of thing. And the same material in source, the material assets can generate shaders for multiple vertex factories depending on the usage flags. Shader formats are the term we just use to refer to the shader-related code and data types for a single runtime target. Now, most platforms only have one runtime target, but PC can target multiple. So you got SM5, SM6, you've got Vulkan, you've got the mobile render. All these can be generated for PC. Each shader format has a corresponding compiler implementation in C++ that usually calls into an external compiler tool, but also does a bunch of UE-specific kind of pre-processing and post-processing on the data. Now, shader compilation phases. When you're running the editor, engine startup, map loading, and play in editor all have to compile different sets of shaders at different times. This is why we always have different delays on, waiting for shaders in the editor. I just wanted to explain the reason for that. First, global shaders, default shaders, these are all kind of prerequisites for running the editor at all. So they're done during the startup phase. When you load a map in the editor, we're going to basically compile all the shaders that are needed to render that map in the editor context, versus play in editor where you're running game logic, loading additional assets, and you need to compile different shaders to render things in game context. Now, contrasting that to what occurs during a cook, we have the same exact initialization phase, except it's based on the number of whichever target platforms you're targeting for your cook. So all the global shaders, all the default shaders compile for every target platform. But then basically cooks just are processing packages, loading a package up, saving a package out. During that process, those packages will say, hey, I need to compile a bunch of shaders. So we block the package save until all that shader compilation is completed. Finally, a shader invalidation. That's just the term we use to describe any code or content changes which trigger shaders recompiling. This can be just a change to a base material, shader code change, various version bumps we have in the engine. Full invalidation is one which requires all shaders to recompile. So we have a shader version.ush header file, which we bump a GUID in to force all shaders to recompile. We typically have to do this if we change some kind of core serialization format, core data format, or just for some reason we want to compile everything again. So let's dig into the key problem then. Why do we have so many shaders? So as I mentioned on the previous slide, material shaders are generally by far the most numerous. So we're just going to consider those here. So we've got a simplified equation here. It gives us an upper bound for the total material permutation count, which is the number of materials multiplied by the number of vertex factories, multiplied by the number of shader types, multiplied by the number of shader formats. There's a lot of terms here, obviously. So the reason I say this is upper bound is because obviously you're not going to have all vertex factories, all shader types enabled for all materials, but you could in theory. So this top magenta term in the equation is content dependent essentially. So artists creating new materials or new material instances can add new shaders to a project. Whereas all the orange terms are essentially an engineering's control. So rendering engineers adding new features are quite frequently adding new shader types to a project or new permutations of shader types. Less frequently they'll add new vertex factories. It's not quite as common. Shader format's also generally an engineering's control, though these tend not to change very often. It's basically just down to what kind of configurations your project's targeting. But the key point I want to make here is that at least two of these variables grow regularly over time. And that's where the crux of the problem is. We have to figure out some way of keeping up with that growth. So, digging a bit deeper, this content term is actually kind of an oversimplification. There's a lot more levers that content actually has to create new permutations. So in reality, we can create new materials, new material instances, add static switches to a material or a material function, add quality level variations to a material or material function. And again, all these can, but don't necessarily result in permutations being created. And this depends entirely on how material instances differ from their base material. So if the base material exposes static switches, changing the values on a material instance will result in permutations being created for that unique set of static parameter values. You can also just toggle material property overrides on instances, which can result in activation of additional shader types. So we don't automatically create all possible variations of the base material. we only create those that are required by the superset of instances that exist in your project. So goes back to what I said before about this all being an upper bound. So basically, one of the keynote is if you have multiple material instances that all happen to set the exact same parameter values and have the same base material, they'll be deduplicated in memory. So we're not wasting space when we don't have to. I do want to dig into the static switch issue a bit more, though, because this is one of the biggest pitfalls in some of our internal projects, at least, is their very widespread use. And each Boolean switch you add to a material could potentially increase the number of shaders compiled for that material by up to 2x, right? So a long time ago, dynamic branching was expensive on GPUs by default, always. So the idea of reducing instruction count to optimize shader execution cost was kind of like the de facto standard way of optimizing materials. The thing is, it's not really as relevant on modern hardware, but that's still kind of standard practice for a lot of content creators. I've had conversations many times with artists who say, oh, I can't do this because it's going to add shader instructions and I'm wasting instructions. And say, well, maybe you should measure it, right? So that's my suggestion is basically don't always add static switches unless you really need to. We do have a similar problem with global shaders too, even though they're in engineering's control. But basically, that's a historical issue. Years and years ago, it was just default permute, don't dynamic branch in a global shader. And going back and kind of undoing this is a very long, time-consuming, lengthy process. So older versions of UE did some level of shader and shader compilation deduplication. So as I just mentioned, material instances with matching parameters will share the same shader map, so we don't even actually submit compile jobs for those. Those are just the cheapest way of avoiding shader compilation. Now, at the point of submitting a shader compilation job, if all the code and compilation settings match exactly, the compilation itself is going to be done only once, and the results are shared and cached into memory for reuse later on. This can be the case basically when a shader type isn't influenced by differences in static switches or material property override values. Now, after compilation, duplicate shader bytecode outputs, what comes out of the compiler, is only stored once in the final runtime shader library. So any jobs which result in identical output will just reference a single shared asset. So this prevents additional runtime memory usage, additional PSO compilation costs on platforms which have PSO compilation at runtime. And this final bytecode deduplication is actually the most impactful. We save a lot here, but to do this, we see that we're just doing a lot of unnecessary compilation work. We just can't tell it's unnecessary until after the compiler runs dead strips unused code, and we get the output the other end. So with all this in mind, there's a few strategies I can suggest to manage shader counts without needing to make any changes to the engine. And first, and maybe most obvious, is just keep tight control over the number of materials you create for your project. Fewer base materials means fewer potential permutation variations that can create it down the line, and artists should generally prefer to be creating material instances whenever possible. They're more likely to be deduplicated. Second is just avoid static switches in base materials and material functions whenever you can. Prefer uniform parameters even at the cost of increased instruction count, and don't assume that higher instruction count means slower, just profile. Possibly it's not going to help in the way you think it will, especially on more modern hardware. Now, caveat, it's not always possible to avoid static switches. Material Translator currently doesn't handle dynamic branching around uniform parameters very well. It computes both inputs and then selects on the result, which is obviously not ideal. This is one of the things our new Material Translator is going to address, so stay tuned. It's in development right now. We don't have any promised versions yet, but it's coming. You also might need a static switch to branch around a texture sample, both just to avoid memory loads or even just to avoid exceeding sample limits and preventing your shaders from compiling at all in the first place. So these are, some of the valid reasons to have static switches right now, but we're hoping to do some stuff to improve this. Third is just analyzing what shaders are actually used in your game. We find often we just have things that are compiled that are never used. Look at your materials, disable any unnecessary material usage flags, unused rendering features can be disabled, sometimes by CVARs and settings, that kind of thing. We do have a couple of new features in 5.6 that can help you analyze this stuff. First is a runtime command called list shaders. You can see the output of that on the left here. Basically just tells you all the shaders have been loaded and created at runtime. And on the right is a cook artifact, the shader type stats, which is another CSV, which basically tells you all the shaders that were compiled during the cook and packaged into the shader library. So any discrepancies between these two lists can basically be leads into features that you might be able to disable or usage flags you might be able to turn off. So if you find any unused shaders that don't have any apparent toggle, please reach out to us. We're going through this process a lot internally right now and trying to analyze and turn things off where we can. But our use cases are probably very different than yours, so we're probably going to miss some. Now, this is just a brief detour to talk about on-demand shader compilation. This came about in UE5. It, roughly speaking, allows you to run with incomplete and initially empty material shader maps in the editor. So only shaders required by the visible scene will be compiled when they're needed on demand. While this compilation is in progress, objects are just going to render with the default materials. Now, as the request is complete, we replace the shader maps and the render objects are invalidated and then picked up the new materials on the fly. So this means that map load and play in editor, those two compilation phases I mentioned before, are just compiling a lot less shaders than they were in UE4 days. So it's a much better situation than it was. It's not perfect, but it's better. This, however, is basically an editor workflow thing. It doesn't really impact the cook process at all. So I'm not really going to delve into a lot of detail here, but there is a reason I bring it up, and it's that it introduced a per shader cache. Basically, results of a single shader compilation job is cached in DDC, meaning the results of any ODSE request could be persisted from one editor session to the next. Now, at the time, this only happened locally, so only one user could share results over and over again. It wasn't put into shared caches at all. And again, like I said, only in editor. So, but this was a key kind of piece of groundwork and made us realize that per shader caching was somewhat viable. It just needed some work. So just a bit of a diagram to kind of show you the old version of the shader compilation flow. Only full shader maps cast to DDC. Any misses on DDC queries necessitated that all shaders for the shader map would be either compiled or possibly, and not really terribly commonly, retrieved from the previously mentioned in-memory shader compiled job cache. The reason why this cache on average wasn't very impactful is because the cache key for the individual shaders was also based on full source, not preprocessed source or anything like that. So this effectively only happened when different instances of the same material contained shaders which weren't dependent on static parameters or usage flags or static parameters or material property overrides. So with that, I'm going to move on to what is the bulk of the talk. It's the work that came out of our strike team. So our first big win came in the form of a library we refer to as the shader minifier. So we were profiling DXC, the DirectX shader compiler, and we saw just a lot of time spent in front-end parsing, ASD creation, that kind of thing. UE shaders tend to be very large after pre-processing, like over a megabyte in size, thousands and thousands of functions, often very little of which was actually used in the final shader, but it was still being parsed. So the idea came about, what if we do a coarse dead stripping prepass? Can we do this fast enough to offset the cost of it by gains in compile time? And it turns out the answer is yes, and by quite a margin. So the rough process here is we divide our shader source files into chunks. And the chunks are things like functions, cbuffer declarations, variable declarations, etc. We find all the chunks that are relevant to a single entry point or a set of entry points. And then we just emit a new copy of a source containing only those chunks. So results, we basically, that front-end compile cost almost disappeared. It pretty much evaporated. Overall compile time, especially on some of the worst case shaders, which strip most of the code, improved significantly. So we rolled this out. It was experimental in 5.1 and 5.2. It was on by default in 5.3 for everything except for Metal and OpenGL. And then I think in 5.4, it was on by default for everything. Now, spoiler alert, with this in place, we started just noticing that a lot of shaders were exactly the same. From different materials, different passes, things that don't even make sense to be related, they just were identical. So this led us to think we can probably take advantage of this somehow to further improve our pre-compilation deduplication. So next, we actually revisited our pre-processing library as well. So in 5.1 and earlier, we were relying on MCBP, which is really old, mid-2000s C++ library, preprocess of all our shaders, but not really maintained, not owned by anybody. Quite slow. We profiled it, compared it against DXC's preprocessor, and found it was almost twice as slow. It also wasn't thread safe, so we always had to run preprocessing in our shader compile worker separate executable process in order to parallelize. So we did evaluate DXC itself, as I mentioned, but we did abandon this approach because first of all, the way it output code was just really weird and inflexible. There was no configurability whatsoever. We didn't want to have to make changes to it. And in general, we also just didn't want to have to rely on DXC for all of our target platforms, something we don't really have direct control over. Now, Epic, around the same time, acquired Rad Game Tools, which was great. Came to light, they had a fast pure C preprocessor that came about as part of like a shelved Rad compiler project. So we started testing it. Early tests showed quite a good improvement over DXC and even better over MCVP, though it was incomplete. It needed some work to make it fit for a purpose in the shader compile system. So most notably, we had to add this file loading virtualization mechanism because we have virtual shader file paths in UE. We also did a big pass to improve stability, memory usage, performance, heavily optimized a bunch of the bottlenecks that appeared when we were analyzing how it performed on our large shader code base. But yeah, with these improvements in place, it was introduced as experimental also in UE 5.2 and enabled by default in 5.3, at which point we kicked MCVP to the curb and everyone was happy. So the most critical work in this whole process follows on from what I noted 2 slides ago, which is that shaders just tend to become identical after preprocessing and minification. So we had this per shader DDC casting mechanism from ODSC, and we theorized and confirmed with some analysis that preprocessing and minifying the source for each individual shader during the job submission process, and then enabling this per shader cache by default and allowing it to cache to shared caches, generating cache keys for this layer based on a hash of the preprocessed and stripped source would allow us to significantly reduce the number of shaders compiled in the flow cook. Again, some work required to accomplish this. The main thing was we had to refactor all of our shader formats. So preprocessing and compilation were previously part of a monolithic compile step. They're kind of intrinsically linked. So there was just a lot of refactoring work to separate these 2 things out. We did a big optimization pass on shader job creation, submission, and we also parallelized it. So it was previously mostly serial work on the game thread and just a lot of time low-hanging fruit there to gain on algorithmic improvements. And then finally, we flipped the switch on allowing individual shaders to be cached to the shared caches, so lifting the editor-only and local-only restrictions that ODSC came with. Now, the final step here revealed some bottlenecks within DDC. Most notably, that the shared file system DDC mechanism just couldn't handle the load of millions of requests during a cook. And this actually became the primary cook bottleneck and actually slowed our cooks down, so it was kind of taking us backwards. However, we have Zen server. So we just punted file system DDC to the curb internally, spin up shared Zen server mechanisms in a bunch of locations, and that just kind of solved the problem. We also did some restructuring of how DDC's response tasks were prioritized to allow better interleaving of background work, so which basically meant the DDC requests completed faster, we could kick off shader compiled jobs faster, or get higher throughput, and faster cooks. That was pretty impactful as well. Sorry. So on top of the improved deduplication rate, there's actually a lot of other benefits from caching based on preprocessed and minified source. And the biggest advantage comes from the fact that the big shader invalidations, which were the crux of most of our cook problems, become much less frequent. And there's a few reasons why this is the case. First, we added a final kind of preprocessing step to strip comments, normalize white space, everything else to make shaders look as close as possible, which meant those trivial invalidations, things like changing comments and changing white space, no longer cause recompilation, which is great. Small changes in a shared header to like isolated functions won't necessarily trigger a large invalidation anymore. Only the shaders which actually use the code tend to be recompiled, because otherwise minifier probably strips those functions. Great. This is a fun one. I don't know if you've caught this before, but in like 5.3 and earlier, if you changed an Xbox header, all the PS5 shaders would compile. And it sounds dumb, but the reason this was happening was because our hashing mechanism for hashing the shader source, we don't have enough context at that point to do preprocessing, so we can't strip out all those includes. So the hashing is basically just a dumb scan of all the include directives, loads any of the files it can. It's permissive, so if it can't load the file, it just ignores it. But that meant, if you found a file on disk, or like had some, we had some PS5 specific code in the header, that's going to invalidate all shaders on all platforms, even though it should only touch PS5. So obviously during preprocessing, all the includes are removed. This issue just magically disappears. So also, obviously, Enabling per shader caching meant that on average, fewer shaders are compiled because you're sharing results between multiple users. So chances are pretty good someone has already requested and compiled the shader, especially for active projects on large teams who use shared binary builds. People who aren't modifying materials just rarely have to compile any shaders at all anymore. We analyzed performance on this around like the 5.5 timeframe because we weren't 100% sure that it was going to be faster to cache than it was to compile a lot of these shaders. But after a lot of measurements, we determined it made sense to just turn this on by default. So both for cooks and for editor, per shader caching is now on by default in 5.5 and later. So effectively now we have 2 layers of caching for shaders. So the previous shader mapping caching still exists and functions basically exactly the same way it did before. But the big distinction is when we get a miss on the shader map cache, we just generally retrieve cache results for all the individual shaders rather than need to actually do any compilation. So cache hits on shader maps effectively just bypass the pre-processing cost. So those are the big ticket items, but there was a bunch of other work that came out of the Strike team as well. So I'll just run through that here quickly. First, a number of similar vertex factories were merged, and this kind of just reduced the overall shader count by a small but not insignificant margin and had negligible runtime performance cost. And this one saves both compile time, but also saves runtime memory and PSO compilation costs as well, because it meant we have less shaders in the final shader library. So we also had this problem for a long time. We knew we were incurring extra duplication of shader data in DDC because of how the shader map records are structured. Essentially, these are just raw byte arrays of shader code that's packed into each individual shader map, which meant multiple shader maps that did share the same code in runtime weren't sharing it in DDC. And we actually, this affects both the cook memory as well as DDC overhead. So and at various points in the cook, we're basically copying these buffers around from the job result into the shader map output object, into the in-memory cache, then finally into the shader library. So there's just like multiple levels of duplication, which is unnecessary. Also, once we enabled per shader caching, we weren't duplicating between the shader map and the per shader bucket either. So that was basically, it was more than doubling our DDC overhead. It was a huge increase in overhead for the initial kind of rollout of our preprocessed cache. So we did address this before it got released. We exploited a nice property of DDC here, which is that value attachments on a DDC record are stored in a content address store, so a CAS mechanism. So basically, to minimize this footprint, fix this problem, all we need to do is separate these bytecode arrays into value attachments. If their hashes are identical, they're automatically going to be deduplicated by DDC, even across buckets. So it was a fairly easy change. So with this in mind, we create a shared buffer for code immediately on job completion. We keep this in the in-memory cache and pass it around as a pointer instead. So this reduced DDC storage overhead, got us back into the range where we were prior to introducing per shader caching in the first place. But it also was a big memory optimization for cooks, especially when you're compiling a lot of shaders. We did also a similar optimization for symbol buffers, shader debug symbols with similar large gains. So with both of these in place, our job cache mechanism, which already did have a memory limit, it wasn't really doing a lot. Now that job cache owns the bytecode and symbol buffers as well. So effectively, it introduced a nice hard memory limit on how much shader output data we stored in memory during a cook. If we exceed the limit, we just evict things. But if we need those things later, again, they're in the cook, we have them in DDC, so we just retrieve them again. So it's kind of the eviction is not really that impactful. We didn't really notice any problems from doing that. So it's a good to have kind of like a fixed memory limit for shader compilation, which we never had before. Oh, missed a couple points there. We also did a round of low-level optimizations to DXC itself. This was primarily focused on improving performance of inlining and exporting debug information. So the target here was to address the compile time of some particularly bad outlier shaders. We're taking over a minute to compile a single permutation, as well as reducing the compile time discrepancy from cooking with symbols on versus symbols off. So on D3 DSM6, which is the one that uses our modified version of DXC, the situation is much improved here, but this obviously only addresses one shader format. Vulkan has its own set of problems which remain to be addressed, unfortunately. We also implemented caching and material translation results. So we noticed that large materials could take hundreds of milliseconds to translate, while round trip time to our Zen shared DDC is usually single or double digit milliseconds. So we did implement this as a race to avoid the possibility that the cache request would take longer than translation itself, which tended to be common for some very small materials. So whichever of the translation or DDC request completes first causes the other one to abort. And one final piece of the puzzle here is Unreal Build Accelerator, or UBA for short. If you're not already aware of this, it's an Epic-developed distributed build system. And out of the box, it just performs better than other external products on identical hardware. Now, I don't have any actual hard numbers to back this up, but anecdotally, it's been consistently faster for everyone who's tried this. So we suggest exploring it if you have the means. Now, this was built specifically to improve code builds initially, but we also use it for distributed shader compilation now. And we've had a really good collaboration with the primary developer, added a bunch of features specifically useful for shader compilation. So I got a couple of examples. Is a virtual input-output file mechanism. So our shader compile worker files were previously being written out to disk. And that just costs I/O and it's not really necessary. So now we just keep that in memory. We register a virtual file with UBA, and it handles automatically distributing that content to workers as needed. This isn't rolled out yet, I'll caveat. We're aiming for 5.8. There's still a few kinks to work out, but it's coming. We also have some visualization improvements. The UBA visualizer you see on the right here. So our shader jobs are batched into groups. And you can see like the list of all the jobs, all the shaders that compiled in this one batch of jobs right here. We also have the blue line at the top there, which gives you a graph over time of how many processes are in flight at once, which was really useful to help us analyze, how often during a cook we are making good use of shared helpers in UBA. So, having gone through the details of all these optimizations, let's revisit that compilation flow diagram from earlier with the new components in place. So first, shader maps, query DDC as before, keys still constructed from raw source file hashes, but it just serves to avoid additional costs if everything is guaranteed to be up to date, so in the case that no shader code is changed at all. But if we get a miss on the shader map query, instead of compiling all shaders, we're going to execute pre-processing and minification, generate cache keys for all the individual shaders based on that pre-processed output. And then we run another query for each shader, which first checks the in-memory cache, followed by querying DDC if we didn't find it in memory. And then only then any out-of-date compiled jobs will actually execute and cache the results. So then we combine the results of any cache hits with the results of any shaders that compiled and cache the new complete shader map in memory. So I mentioned earlier the number candy, and here we go. There's a lot of data on this slide, so I'm gonna run you through it. Gathered these numbers, I just ran a number of cooks of the city sample project on both 5.1 and on 5.7. The state of 5.7 around early August. I haven't updated these numbers since then, so I don't think there's gonna be much difference in the final release. And this was specifically just compiling D3D SM6. That was the only shader format that was enabled in City Sample in 5.1. We do have Vulkan enabled on City Sample by default right now, but I turned that off for this test, just so we're comparing apples to apples. So there were 3 tests that I ran. First is a full invalidation. So I bumped shader version.ush, causes all shaders to recompile. Did the same thing again, but with symbols on. And then finally, I did a partial invalidation. I just made a small change to a single function in common.ush, which is the pseudo volume texture function, which is used by only a small handful of shaders. So I also ran all these tests with a fully primed DDC from a previous cook, just to make sure that only shader work is being done in these cooks. So no other impact. So I want to highlight a few things that can be attributed to the work we've done. First, you see the number of shaders requested and the number of shaders compiled are quite a bit lower on 5.7 than 5.1. This is showing the impact of both the shader reduction and deduplication improvements. Cook durations across the board, you can see, are significantly better. 37 minutes to 14 minutes for a full invalidation, and an hour and 15 to 15 minutes for a full invalidation with symbols on. Basically, and also you'll notice the symbols on cook, the discrepancy between those cooks on 5.7 has basically disappeared. The compile time is still higher, it's just we're parallelizing way better, so that compile time is essentially hidden now. You also notice the average pre-processing time is quite a bit better. This is in addition, even though we have added 2 additional pre-processing passes in the minifier and the the normalization pass. There was one note here in that now we pre-process every shader, not just the ones that actually make it to the compiler. So the averages are calculated based on the higher of those 2 numbers, the requested number rather than the compiled number on 5.7 versus 5.1. So we pre-process more, but it costs less. So it's still good. We see quite a bit of improvement to average compile time with symbols off, and a much better improvement with symbols on. This is attributed to both the combination of minifier reducing the front-end cost and our DXE optimizations kind of improving the remainder. We see a bit of an increase on cache hit rate. I do want to say with City Sample, this is kind of an outlier. City Sample having a 32% cache hit rate on 5.1 was very unusual. We saw on most projects this was way lower. It's just City Sample was a good test case because they had a lot of shaders to compile. So that's the one I used. In practice, we find the improvement in cache hit rate much bigger on other real game projects. So the main win here, at least for our internal projects, is the big difference between the 2 partial invalidation cooks. So we went from 37 to 12 minutes. So that small change in comma.ush was basically a full invalidation on 5.1. As you see, we basically recompiled every single shader versus 21 shaders compiled in 5.7. So that's a big improvement, obviously. We also have a bit of a sneak peek of the incremental cook mechanism. You could see that those 2 cooks there, the wall time improvement was not proportional to how much shader compilation we were no longer doing. So that indicated to me that it wasn't shader compilation that was the bottleneck in those cooks anymore. And this incremental cook kind of proves that. 37 minutes down to 3 minutes. There was a bit of DDC storage impact here because essentially we're still changing the shader map keys. So we need to repackage the shader maps. But because we're deduplicating bytecode, the impact is pretty small. It's only 20 megabytes. Now, there is a bit of a cost. DDC storage requirements are still about 20% higher in 5.7 than 5.1 because of with symbols disabled, sorry. But we feel this is really well worth all the other improvements. If you're cooking with symbols on, though, you're actually saving quite a bit of space here because the cost of not deduplicating those in memory was really hurting us before. I also wanted to show you a graph of memory usage over time on the same cooks. Well, not exactly the same cooks because this is tracing was enabled, so it extended the wall time a little bit. But you can compare memory usage before and after, and you can see basically it peaked about 20 gigabytes lower in 5.7 than 5.1. So cooks are both significantly faster and less memory intensive. And my measurements suggest, or previous measurements suggested that the shared buffer optimizations I mentioned earlier were responsible for basically most of this improvement. Great. So my intent for this talk was to summarize kind of the last few years of effort to improve the default state of compiling shaders in UE, but we are not finished by any stretch of the imagination. I'll caveat that not everything I mentioned here is guaranteed to actually happen. We don't actually have timelines for a lot of it, but at the very minimum, they're kind of validated ideas that we have in the pipeline. So first is just we want to provide better in-editor mechanisms to allow content creators to see and understand when changes they're making are incurring additional permutations. As you can see by the explanation of it at the start of the talk, it's not really trivial or easy to understand for the average content creator or even the average engineer for that matter. Vertex factories, I think, may not be necessary, at least on a lot of modern GPUs. We should be able to just write dynamically branching vertex fetch code. The question is just what platforms we can do it on, what's the GPU time impact, is it acceptable? But if we can make it work, it should be a big reduction in the number of shaders we actually need overall, even in the runtime final shader library. It's also possible that if we can't go fully dynamic, we still might be able to collapse some additional targeted vertex factories that are similar enough to not have any performance regression. So we're looking into that right now. As I mentioned previously, the new material translator is coming. Implementation's underway. There's a number of areas where this is going to help us in terms of shader reduction. So first is, as I mentioned before, proper dynamic branching, reduce the need for static switches to avoid expensive work. The one that I think is potentially more promising is combining proper dynamic branching with bindless. Means we're able to just convert all of our static switches that are hiding texture samples to dynamic branches and just reduce tons of permutations without actually having any impact at all, because we're not going to be exceeding sampler limits anymore, and we also won't be loading the redundant data in the GPU. So we're still compiling a lot more shaders than we need. Generally, we're still seeing about 2 to 2.5 times as many compile jobs as we are seeing final result bytecode output. So limitation of minifiers, it doesn't modify functions, it only calls them as a whole piece. So with materials, our translator outputs everything in one single monolithic function, which contains a bunch of what is dead code, but we can't tell it's dead code, especially for things like shadow, depth, velocity passes. All you really need is your position and your opacity in the case you're doing kind of alpha masking stuff. So what the new translator is going to have is a decoupling of the translation / compile time, compile step from code generation output. So we'll be able to output multiple code gen passes very quickly and easily without incurring a big cost. So essentially we could then take, for depth and shadow passes, just a version of the material code that only outputs, vertex positions, opacity, WPO, anything that affects that kind of stuff, and strip, basically not generate the code that is going to be dead stripped by the compiler in the first place, and then significantly improve our deduplication rate. Our goal is to get as close to 1-to-1 as possible. I don't know how close we're actually going to get, but we're working on it. Now, if you do want more details about the new material translator, not specifically related to reducing shader counts, you can go back and watch the Unreal Materials talk from Camille K. It was this morning, so it's already happened, but the video will be posted later. There's a few minutes at the end of that talk talking about more details of what the new translator is about. So pre-processing is still quite heavy, even when we're doing it fully parallel. And on low core count systems, we've found this can be a new bottleneck that wasn't there prior to 5.5. We've had a few UDNs related to this. So we want to introduce a shader module concept, essentially, that's going to allow us to have shared libraries of pre-processed code that we can just copy verbatim into the output shader, rather than having to pre-process the entire code for every single shader. And that should allow us to cut down the pre-processing costs significantly and increase the throughput of submitting compiled jobs, especially in the editor. So I want to also expand our usage of the UBA virtual files once we've rolled out the initial functionality. I mentioned before, we're batching shader compiled jobs to reduce sending redundant shared data to workers over and over again. But we can also do that by this virtual file mechanism. We can define things like our shader parameter metadata, material, shader compiler environment settings once, store them in memory, and then just have UBA distribute, deduplicate for us. It just happens automatically. And what this will allow us to do is basically get rid of job batching entirely, which means we should be able to load balance a lot better, get much better throughput. And finally, we've had a bunch of requests to implement some form of ODSC for global shaders. Now, it's not quite the same situation as materials because global shaders don't have a valid fallback. But at the very least, we should be able to asynchronously submit all the global shader compiled jobs and just block on a result when it's actually needed for rendering. And yeah, so obviously this was not all my work. There's a lot of people that contributed to this initiative in one way or another. So this is not in any particular order, but thanks to all these people listed here. It was a big team effort and I think a pretty successful result. And we are continuing to work on this stuff. So please reach out to us if you have any feedback in this space. And I think I have a few minutes left for questions. So thank you very much.